On a chilly night in late March 1848, the quiet village of Hydesville, New York, became the stage for a mystery. In a creaking farmhouse, teenage sisters Maggie and Kate Fox listened as their walls and bedposts answered with strange raps in the dark. At first it was a game, questions asked, knocks replied in numbers, but soon the family summoned neighbors, and the tiny bedroom filled with people straining to hear the unseen voice. Rumors spread quickly. The raps were said to come from a murdered peddler buried beneath the cellar. Though digging found only scattered bones, belief had already taken root. In a world haunted by superstition, grief, and longing for proof of the afterlife, the Fox sisters' parlor trick was exactly the sign many people yearned for. From that single night, a movement was born. What began as a childish prank ignited spiritualism, séances in parlors, stages filled with paying crowds, and the promise that the dead could speak to the living. Yet behind the knocks lay a story of ambition, deception, and personal cost. If this story grips you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Let's begin. The house was small, timber-framed, and endlessly talkative. In late March of 1848, the old farmhouse outside Hydesville, Wayne County, New York, seemed to acquire a second life after sundown. Everything creaked, popped, and sighed, the joists shifting as frost lifted from the ground, the bedposts pinging with the cold, the stove ticking itself to sleep. The Fox family, John and Margaret, with their daughters Margaretta, Maggie, 14, and Catherine, Kate, 11, had grown used to country noises. But these were not the ordinary quarrels of wood and winter. The sounds came like signals, sharp raps that traveled along the walls, knocks that seemed to answer back. It began as unease. The parents blamed the wind, then mice, then the settling of a house older than any of them. The girls, by turns frightened and curious, lay awake counting the beats that rose from the floorboards, 2 together, then a pause, then 3. Some nights the knock seemed to skirt the room, hopping from bed frame to cupboard to doorjamb, as if an invisible drummer were circling just out of sight. When the family tiptoed into the parents' room to sleep together, the raps followed. When they moved back, the raps welcomed them. Fear turned the familiar into suspect, chairs, a broom, the iron latch, each might be the next to speak. Curiosity has a way of turning fear into an experiment. By lamplight, with the room crowded by blankets and whispers, the sisters tried speaking to the sounds. If you can hear us, one would say, give us a knock. A single rap answered. How many children are in this family? 3 raps came in quick succession, then a 4th, after a heartbeat, as if the unseen answer were thinking. The girls learned to build a conversation from yes, no questions and counting. Ask for 5, receive 5. Ask for 10, receive 10. The pattern, so simple and repeatable, felt like proof. What machine of coincidence could keep pace with a child's commands? The parents were terrified, but terror can be social. On the most restless nights, their mother ran to the neighbors. Within hours, the little bedroom became a stage. Men with work-rough hands peeled off their hats and stood at the foot of the bed. Women pressed close, shawls tight against the draft. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, shushing each other, eyes bright with the thrill of being awake long past bedtime. Sitting, standing, kneeling, everyone held their breath and waited to be frightened, waited, in truth, to be convinced. And then the knocks came, crisp, hollow, undeniable. A visiting farmer bent to inspect the bedstead, a rap sounded from the wall behind his ear, then from the underside of the floor. Someone crossed the room, 3 raps followed, like a phantom tale. As the household filled with witnesses, the questions grew bolder. Are you a spirit? Rap. Did you die in this house? Rap. Were you murdered? A rapid, emphatic volley. Soon the ghost acquired a backstory, a traveling peddler, the rumor said, a man who had vanished with his wares and his money. If he had been killed, where was he now? Are you buried in the cellar? The knocks multiplied until the floor seemed to tremble. It was a ruinously compelling suggestion. A murder demanded a body, a haunting promised a map. By the next day, men with shovels stood in the cellar, lanterns throwing long shadows along the packed dirt. The family watched as the ground yielded up its sparse catalog, a few strands of hair. A tooth. Later accounts claimed bits of bone. Was it human? Animal? The excavation was more desperation than science, more theater than law. If there had been a crime, time and moisture had already taken their due. What the digging established was not guilt or innocence but atmosphere, a sense that the house itself kept a secret underfoot, and that it had finally found a way to speak. The sisters' performances, if performance they were, settled into recognizable rhythms. They would sit on the bed, hands visible, feet tucked back, while the room watched. Questions with numerical answers worked best, elaborate stories stalled the act. A primitive code emerged, not so different from tapping through a wall, 1 for yes, 2 for no, a flurry of knocks for names spelled out letter by letter using the alphabet. The girls learned what any successful showman knows, that the audience helps build the illusion. The crowd leaned in, supplied details, jealously guarded their own little pieces of the story. My cousin heard it answer the day of the week. It told me the age of my boy. It knew my mother's name. Hydesville was the right place for a miracle, or for a trick that could pass as one. The frontier had pushed past New York long ago, but the rural county still kept the old country blend of piety and superstition. Faith gathered in parlors and meeting houses, grief had few comforts beyond prayer. Newspapers arrived late and stitched entire regions together with rumor and wonder. Most people had lost someone they wanted to see again. A movement that promised the dead could knock on the living's door needed only a room, a few believers, and a night when the cold made every sound carry. What made the phenomenon compelling was not simply the strangeness of the sounds but their obedience. Random noises could be dismissed, responsive raps felt like intention. The sisters had discovered an engine for meaning: ask, and it shall answer. They were children, and children are allowed a kind of holy mischief. Their innocence protected the performance. It also gave it power. If a grown man had claimed to command the dead to knock, he might have been laughed out of the house. But two girls with braided hair and frightened smiles. The room leaned toward them as it would toward the sick, the poor, the blessed. With witnesses came legitimacy. A farmer spread the tale to the next township. A shopkeeper repeated it to a customer who repeated it at supper. A local newspaper sent a curious stringer, who wrote in the confident tone of a man who has seen more than he can explain. Ministers argued in print about the propriety of attending such exhibitions. Some condemned curiosity as a door the devil would be glad to open. Others, more anxious about losing a flock to wonder, counseled moderation and careful inquiry. Careful inquiry, in practice, meant showing up and hoping the knocks would dignify themselves into doctrine. It did not take long for the sisters to discover that the knocks were strongest in some places and weak in others. Hollow furniture helped. Wooden steps carried sound along their backs like a drum. The bed's frame, when set lightly on the floorboards, seemed to act as a sounding board. The family rearranged the room, then rearranged it again, both to test and to optimize. If the girls sat in chairs in the center, the raps came faintly. If they perched on the bed with their heels not quite touching, the knocks traveled with startling clarity. The house and the act co-evolved, a better stage made for a better miracle. Skeptical neighbors made their own experiments. One insisted on holding the girls' wrists while another watched their feet. The raps continued. Someone spread flour on the floor to track any movement. The knocks still came, proving at least that if there was a trick, it was nimble. Each test that failed to expose a mechanism hardened belief. Later, a villager would swear that he had tied the girls' hands together and the sounds had nevertheless wrapped around the room like a spool unwinding. The unexplained becomes, with each failed explanation, a little more holy. All the while, the story of the murdered peddler grew roots. People described his pack, his coins, even his face, assemblies of fact and speculation stitched together after the fact. Every village has a ledger of vanishings, a man who went west and never wrote, a hired hand who settled a debt too quickly and was not seen again. A haunting is a clotting of these rumors into a single ghost that can answer back. When the family dug and found nothing conclusive, believers answered that murderers do not leave neat graves. Doubters countered that ghosts do not produce chicken bones. But the raps were so much more theatrical than bones that the latter felt like a sideshow. The audience preferred sound to evidence. For the girls, the attention changed the air they breathed. Daytime became a waiting room for night, a procession of murmured requests, experiments, and visits. The home, once the site of the uncanny, turned into a destination, doors open late, candles burned down to stubs. Their mother toggled between maternal worry and a manager's pride. Their father, practical and wary, kept the farm going and his opinions guarded, as fathers do when the world tries to move into their daughter's bedroom. The girls themselves, under the weight of eyes and expectation, learned the adult's art of meeting demand. However it began, mischief, chance, the body's strange acoustics, the thing had become something they did, and therefore something they were. By week's end, Hydesville had more visitors than beds. The sisters were coaxed to repeat the demonstrations at friends' houses, in parlors, even on staircases where the knocks marched up and down like a polite army. Each new venue made the act more portable, and portability is the seed of a career. The raps began to belong less to the cramped bedroom and more to the girls themselves, as if they carried the phenomenon with them like an instrument. The first night did not feel like history to those living it. It felt like exhaustion tinged with wonder. People left the farmhouse and walked home across fields glazed with thaw, replaying conversations with an empty chair. In kitchens the next morning, the talk braided practical things, milk, tools, weather, with the news that the boundary between life and death had grown porous down the road. Children imitated the raps on table edges. A few prayed more earnestly than before. A few laughed. Most waited for the next telling. By the time the sisters lay back on their pillows, eyes gritty with smoke and attention, a switch had already flipped. Whatever the raps were, miracle, mischief, or the audible grammar of grief, they had slipped the bonds of a single house. Hydesville had become a lighthouse of sorts, throwing a thin beam into surrounding towns. People oriented themselves to it. And somewhere, beyond the edge of what the girls could have imagined, was a larger room, brighter lights, and a crowd that would pay to hear the dead knock. From a children's bedroom, the raps spilled into the community, turning private mischief into a public phenomenon. Rochester was a city of reformers and experiments, abolitionists, temperance advocates, utopians, Quakers, and the news from Hydesville traveled there as swiftly as a rumor can hitch a ride on conviction. Isaac and Amy Post, prominent Quaker reformers with a home that doubled as a salon for ideas, invited the Fox family to demonstrate the raps in their parlor. Quakers prized plain speech and direct experience. The notion that truth might arrive without clergy, heard with one's own ears, made the raps feel almost familiar. The Posts did not promise doctrine, they promised an audience, a circle of people prepared to listen seriously. In that parlor the act matured. The sisters sat in straight-backed chairs, skirts arranged to keep feet visible, hands on their laps. Guests, activists, newspaper men, respectable matrons, took turns asking questions. The raps answered with their efficient grammar, 1 for yes, 2 for no, numbers counted out in a staccato code. More than spectacle, the evenings were curated encounters with the unseen, conducted in a tone of civic earnestness. Speakers moved easily from talk of abolition or women's rights to the latest séance and back again, as though all belonged to the same broad project, enlarging the circle of what the nation was prepared to accept as true. Leah, the eldest Fox sister, saw in this a path. Older by more than a decade, she had a working woman's sense of what attention could become if properly managed. She stepped into the role that family members so often occupy in show business and revival alike, part chaperone, part impresario, part conscience. She fixed schedules, solicited invitations, smoothed quarrels, and, crucially, framed the girls' displays as moral. The raps, she insisted, were not idle entertainment but a sign intended to comfort the bereaved and to deepen faith. If people paid, it was to support a good work, not to gawk at a trick. With Leah's orchestration and the Post's network, private evenings gave way to larger rooms. The city's appetite for demonstration outgrew parlors. At a certain point an idea needs a hall to prove it's an idea. Notices went up. Newspapers carried brief announcements. Believers and doubters alike marked their calendars. And on the night of November 14, 1849, at Corinthian Hall in Rochester, the Fox sisters stood before a paying audience to let the dead talk. Corinthian Hall was the sort of venue that meant something, big enough to intimidate, handsome enough to flatter, democratic enough to sell its seats. The stage was set with a few plain chairs and a table, gaslight glowed against painted columns. Leah spoke with the measured gravity of a woman making introductions at a reform meeting. She reminded the audience that the girls were young, that the purpose was serious, that disorder would not be tolerated. This was not a carnival, it was a test the public would give itself. The questions, when they came, were tentative at first. A gentleman proposed a simple count, the raps complied. A widow asked whether her departed husband was present. After a pause, a single knock sounded so cleanly that the room breathed out together. The tricks of a theater evening, tension, release, repetition, played themselves out under the sign of consolation. People did not merely witness, they participated. An audience member suggested that the alphabet be recited and that the raps interrupt at the right letter to spell out a name. The stops came at letters that meant something to the questioner. The girls appeared to know what they could not know. Reporters took notes in that clipped, confident way that turns uncertainty into copy. The next morning's accounts described raps that answered intelligently, and a crowd that behaved with commendable sobriety. Letters to editors skirmished over what had been proven. One paper dismissed the credulity of the nervous. Another wondered aloud whether science would someday explain the mechanism. In the meantime, tickets sold. A second date was scheduled, then a third. When a hall fills, the first hypothesis a city makes is that it should fill again. What changed in the move from parlor to stage was scale, and with it, the meaning of the sounds. In a private room, the raps felt like an intimacy shared. In Corinthian Hall they felt like a revelation made democratic. Anyone, for the price of admission, could hear the dead. The sisters' story was retold as a kind of proof by participation, no catechism, no ordained mediator, just a chair, a question, and an answer from the other side. It was a theology of access, perfectly tuned to an America that loved both crowds and self-authentication. Leah leaned into that framing. Her announcement stressed decorum, temperance, and usefulness. She scheduled private circles for those who preferred discreet sittings, and public demonstrations for those who wanted to see a movement born. She fielded correspondence from patrons who wished to subsidize the girls' travel or to arrange appearances in other cities. Money began to flow in the way money flows wherever attention gathers, tickets at the door, retainers for private evenings, gifts pressed into hands, envelopes that balanced piety with payment. Belief and profit grew, if not from the same root, from the same soil. The Posts and their circle continued to lend credibility. Their endorsement functioned as a social bridge, inviting reform-minded citizens to treat curiosity not as sin but as inquiry. At gatherings, prominent voices, editors like Horace Greeley, sympathetic clergymen, lecturers, treated the raps as a phenomenon worth serious hearing. Respectability is contagious. When one known name attends a séance, another can attend without embarrassment. The girls, who a season earlier had been performing in a bedroom, found themselves in rooms where movements were assembled. Not everyone approved. A few ministers denounced the events as profanation. A handful of physicians suggested the girls were subjects of hysteria or self-deception. Magicians, conjurers, as the papers called them, raised eyebrows and muttered about easily faked sounds. Yet the very fact of a public contest over meaning served the sisters. Controversy is an advertisement with the word serious stamped on it. So long as the events remained orderly and the raps arrived on cue, doubt was another form of attention. Meanwhile, the staging itself grew more deliberate. Chairs were moved, platforms tested for resonance, footlights adjusted to keep the girls' limbs visible while the hall stayed dim enough to feel uncanny. Ushers imposed rules: no touching the performers, no shouting questions out of turn, no rushing the stage. Volunteers were invited up to sit beside the sisters and place their hands upon their wrists or shoulders. The raps continued, skittering along the floorboards and up the table legs as though sound itself had made a pact to behave. Each added precaution was a publicity point: we allow every fair test. Each test that failed to stop the knocks became part of the lore. The sisters' travel widened with demand. Rochester to Buffalo, to Albany, to New York City, each stop a repetition of the formula: begin with parlor circles under the wing of a respectable sponsor, scale to a public hall, allow the papers to argue, harvest both belief and curiosity. In every city, the same alchemy worked: grief in the seats, money at the door, raps on the stage. And always Leah, booking dates, negotiating fees, reminding the girls of the line between revelation and mere display. She told them they carried a responsibility. She also made sure they carried it often. By winter's end the enterprise had its own economy. Stationers sold alphabet cards for home circles, carpenters crafted small tables that spoke better. Mediums in the making copied the Fox's methods, adding flourishes, moving tables, spirit alphabets, musical interludes in which a distant piano supposedly played at a ghost's command. The movement center of gravity began to shift from a single family to a fashion, then to a faith. People did not simply attend, they tried it themselves. The Fox sisters' greatest advertisement was the ease with which their act could be imitated by believers who never thought of themselves as performers at all. Even as the enterprise professionalized, Leah held to the moral script. In public remarks she spoke of consolation to the afflicted and the blessed assurance that our loved ones continue. She invited clergy and physicians to observe, not as enemies but as custodians of public reason. The pose was shrewd: to attack the sisters was to attack comfort itself. If a widow found relief in a knock, who would be cruel enough to condemn the knock? Corinthian Hall had proven one great fact: scale multiplies both devotion and doubt. With larger rooms came sharper questions. Some in the crowd wanted not comfort but certainty, proof that could survive a hostile gaze. In the newspapers, columnists who had once reported the raps with neutrality began to press for stricter tests. Could the sisters produce sounds when their feet rested on cushions? Could the raps be heard if they stood upon glass? Could the girls perform after being examined by a committee of respectable women? Each new condition made the stage a laboratory, and laboratories are places where both miracles and illusions unravel. But for the moment, those Rochester nights in 1849, the balance still favored wonder. The sisters could enter a hall and make it listen, Leah could declare a purpose and make it feel true, the posts and their friends could nod gravely and make it seem respectable. Newspapers sold, handbills fluttered, tickets clicked at the door. A movement had stepped out from a farmhouse and learned to hold a crowd. But brighter lights meant tougher scrutiny. Where exactly did the sounds come from? By the early 1850s the raps that began in a Hydesville bedroom had learned the timbre of big rooms. What Rochester proved, that a private amazement could be turned outward and shared, other cities now repeated with enthusiasm and a little rivalry. New York, Boston, and Philadelphia advertised circles in respectable parlors and public demonstrations in rented halls. Respectable here meant mixed company: lawyers and milliners, ministers and skeptics, reformers who had spent their evenings arguing temperance and abolition now taking turns asking a table to spell the name of a dead child. The novelty was not only that the dead might speak, but that anyone might listen. No priesthood was required, the rite could be performed with chairs, a wooden floor, and a willingness to hush. Newspapers, those mid-century engines of consensus and spectacle, amplified the sound. A reporter's half-credulous account in one city was reprinted in another, a letter to the editor in Boston became breakfast talk in Buffalo. The telegraph did not carry knocks, but it carried the feeling that a country might be learning, together, to hear them. Spiritualism's strongest advertisement was its repeatability, not a single miracle in a remote field, but a kit of procedures anyone could attempt at home: ask, count, rap. Parlors became laboratories for grief. In that environment, certain endorsements mattered more than others. The reform salons of Rochester and New York included abolitionists, suffragists, and editors who liked the idea that truth could bypass hierarchy. Horace Greeley, the powerful New York editor and political crusader, lent the cause a kind of muscular respectability by treating the phenomena seriously and by offering personal sympathy to the sisters. Quakers, long practiced in the discipline of waiting upon an inner voice, found in the raps a secular cousin to revelation. Spiritualism braided itself to other 19th-century impulses: self-improvement lectures, phrenology readings, mesmerism shows, the grand American habit of testing yourself in public and calling the result reform. The movement's most potent accelerant, however, was loss. Even before the Civil War, American households were used to mourning: cholera, childbirth, farm accidents, fevers that leaped children by the handful. Then came 1861 to 1865, when entire towns counted their dead by dozens. The agony had a shape: the empty chair at the table, the letter that never arrived, names scrolled into newspapers in tight black columns, and it demanded new consolations. A nation that had been reading lists of the fallen now read advertisements for mediums. The promise was seductively modest: not heaven's geography, not doctrine, but evidence that the line between here and there could flex long enough to knock once, softly, in reply. The practice followed need. Home circles multiplied, families and neighbors gathering after supper, alphabet cards laid out, questions asked in whispers. Parlors acquired standard props, small tables prized for resonance, slates for chalked messages, planchettes, the forerunner to later talking boards, to guide one trembling hand. In public rooms, mediums added theatrical vocabulary, spirit trumpets, to amplify whispers, musical interludes with instruments that seemed to sound by themselves, a cabinet or screened corner from which voices floated. The Fox sisters, unwilling founders, saw a city of imitators rising around them. What had been their signature grammar, yes/no knocks, numbers counted out, became part of a larger language used by dozens of other mouths. Overseas, the impulse translated easily. Paris and London enjoyed a mania for table turning in the mid-1850s. Fashionable drawing rooms arranged themselves around furniture that quivered and capered as if it had joined the conversation. Serious men wrote playful papers, playful men wrote serious ones. In Britain, celebrated mediums demonstrated feats that nudged the category from knocking to levitation, from replies to embraces. Newspapers printed the same braided argument being made in America: whatever the mechanism, something happened in these rooms worth registering, perhaps even worth respecting. And if some of it was fraud, was not some small portion also a genuine stimulus from the other side? Religion watched with a careful eye. Certain pulpits thundered that spirits, if any, should be addressed to God, not coaxed by girls with quick hands. Other pulpits, noticing that many of the grieving now spent their evenings at circles, softened their tone to pastoral caution. A few explicitly Christian spiritualist congregations formed, mixing hymn and séance, sermon and testimony, in which widows and parents stood to describe messages received and thanksgiven. The movement's very lack of dogma, the sense that anyone might learn its techniques in an evening, meant that it could flow around obstacles instead of colliding with them. It seeped into communities rather than confronting them. From the perspective of the sciences, plural because mid-century, science included both sober experiment and hopeful conjecture, spiritualism arrived with a challenge it knew how to meet: test it. Demonstrations invited committees to inspect, to bind hands, to mark chalk, to lay sand or flour under tables to catch footprints. If a medium insisted on dim light, that could be negotiated down to a compromise glow. The room became part church, part lecture hall, part laboratory, and each failed exposure functioned as a kind of data point for believers. Even certain men of learning, attracted by the possibility that unknown forces might be measured, found themselves peering under furniture with more hope than scorn. Apparent spirit photography in the 1860s, double exposures mistaken for visitations, added a technological subtitle to the raps: the dead could appear as well as speak. The press did not merely transmit, it exaggerated. Reports recounted séances where names and dates were given with miraculous accuracy, details never quite verifiable after the fact but too precise, in the telling, to be ignored. Critics rebutted with their own columns, stage magicians offered public lectures on how any competent conjurer might produce knocks with concealed mechanisms or well-trained toes, and pamphleteers denounced mediums as leeches on grief. P. T. Barnum, that prince of showmen and exposures, folded spiritualism into his anthology of humbugs. Yet the more the movement had to argue for itself, the more it developed a prose of self-defense. This is consolation, this is inquiry, this is progress. The Fox sisters themselves became both icons and targets. Their names hung over ads for other mediums' appearances, pupil of the Foxes, in the Hydesville manner, even as detractors used them as shorthand for gullibility. A profile might begin with a respectful sketch of their first nights and end with a raised eyebrow about their finances, their sobriety, their suitors. Fame, especially for women who made a living by being looked at and believed, was a hall of mirrors. In some cities they were honored guests at reformers' tables, in others they were subjects of rumor before they arrived. They had done the cultural labor of opening a door and now watched a crowd pour through it, taking the furniture. Meanwhile, the economy built around belief hardened into industry. Publishers issued instructional manuals for forming circles. Lecturers crisscrossed the states with trunks full of slates and trumpets. Stationers sold alphabet boards, photographers, honest and otherwise, offered portraits with extras. Money changed hands in small, defendable amounts, a nickel for admission, $1 for a private sitting, a subscription fee for a periodical that covered the movement with pious persistence. Where money flows, rules follow. Halls adopted policies about lighting and proximity, endorsers required testimonials, mediums displayed letters from grateful patrons as if they were diplomas. Those years also clarified the movement's fault lines. Believers did not agree on what, precisely, they believed. For some, spiritualism was a supplement to Christianity, a proof of continued life that made resurrection feel less remote. For others, it was a new revelation, a republic of spirits whose citizens counseled moral improvement and social reform from the far shore. A small but noisy faction insisted on material proofs, hands that could be shaken, flowers that dropped from nowhere, instruments that played. Such demands invited theater, theater invited trickery. Every spectacular manifestation that delighted a Friday audience became Exhibit A for Saturday's debunker. And yet the grief economy remained stubbornly simple. A woman who had buried a son could come to a room and ask for one knock. If it came on cue, it filled a space no editorial could fill. A father could ask a question known only to his household and hear an answer that, by coincidence, by sly prompting, by genuine marvel, matched. The human mind, when offered a pattern in the dark, will find a face in it. Spiritualism gave mourners a grammar for such faces and a schedule on which to see them. In the 1870s, as the war's veterans aged and the nation's appetite for spectacle grew, the movement diversified further. Test séances promised strict conditions, full-form séances promised something close to touch. Periodicals debated terminology and technique. Theaters that had once hosted temperance lectures offered evenings of scientific investigation. The Fox sisters, older now, drifted in and out of the center as other names rose. Yet their origin story remained the movement's catechism: 2 girls, a dark room, a question asked and answered. With notoriety came surveillance. Police occasionally raided performances on the complaint of fraud, judges adjudicated quarrels between disgruntled patrons and itinerant mediums, newspapers ran exposes with diagrams of hidden mechanisms under stages or clever use of the body's own acoustics. Some debunkings were honest, some were rival showmen's advertisements in disguise. For every exposure there was a counter-testimony from a respected citizen who had held a medium's hands in his and still heard the reply travel up the table leg. The argument taught both sides to sharpen their tools. If the sisters felt squeezed, it was because they were, between being symbols of a consolation industry and being subjects to a scrutiny industry. Leah continued to present their work as moral labor, a comfort offer to a wounded public, reform circles continued to host them as curiosities that might also be truths. But the mood of inquiry had shifted. The more rooms they entered, the more precisely those rooms wanted to control the experiment: brighter lights, harder floors, watchers not chosen by the family, questions written in advance, the alphabet recited by a stranger. Success under such conditions meant reputation, failure meant whispers that traveled faster than trains. By the end of the decade, the map of spiritualism looked like a weather chart: hot spots of fervor, cool zones of skepticism, fronts moving where itinerant mediums left brief seasons of conviction behind them. The Fox sisters were still invoked as the movement's beginning, but the story had outrun them in scale and variety. Even those who doubted that the dead knocked were obliged to notice that the living had learned to. In homes where grief had silenced conversation, the new nightly rite had taught people to sit together, to formulate questions, to await an answer with the stillness of prayer. From a distance of years, what stands out is not simply that an entertainment spread but that a method did, a reproducible ritual for turning longing into signal. It was a 19th-century solution to a 19th-century ache, aligned with the century's love of devices and explanations. Telegraphs clicked, cameras conjured ghosts, tables walked, and the human desire for proof tapped its fingers on wood. Inevitably, those fingers drew attention. If the movement demanded respect on the grounds of experience, then experience would be refined into tests. The more fame they gained, the more people demanded proof, and skeptics sharpened their knives. The parlor had given way to the hall now had to make room for the laboratory. If spiritualism claimed the authority of experience, come and hear for yourself, then cities, newspapers, and learned societies were prepared to test the experience. The Fox sisters and their many imitators found themselves surrounded by committees and contraptions: pillows to place under feet, glass plates to stand upon, sand laid carefully around chair legs to catch a stray nudge. What had begun as a family drama turned into a civic experiment with rules, witnesses, and minutes taken. The first lesson skeptics learned was acoustic: wooden rooms are generous accomplices. Hollow stages, sprung floors, and thin furniture carried a knock along their ribs until it seemed to appear wherever a hearer wanted it to be. Put a chair on a bare plank and the seat became a drum, touch a bedpost and the whole frame hummed. Mediums, whether by discovery or instruction, gravitated to the sweet spots, corners and risers that returned a pop like a thrown voice. When a demonstration was moved to stone or a thickly carpeted parlor, the raps often grew shy. The spirits prefer plain, honest materials, Leo would say with a smile that closed the argument and opened the door. But the more inventive doubt pushed, the more specific its accusations became. A rumor spread, then a charge in print, that certain mediums, including the Fox sisters, produced raps by cracking the joints of the toes. The physiology, once explained, had the unnerving plausibility of a locked box suddenly opened. The ball and socket of the metatarsophalangeal joint can be trained to emit a dry, snapping sound. With the foot resting lightly against wood, the vibration conducts into the furnishing as if the knock came from within. In a dim hall the sound seemed to travel, scurrying up table legs and along floorboards. A body could make a room speak. To meet that accusation, committees multiplied controls. Respectable women, teachers, matrons, reformers, were invited to sit beside the sisters, hold their hands, and watch their skirts. Gentlemen on the platform knelt to inspect the floor between demonstrations. In some tests, the medium's feet were placed on cushions, where a crack would be swallowed if it came from the body. In others, the sisters stood on glass set upon blocks, a soundproof island within the oaken sea. Sometimes the raps persisted, faint, then clearer, as the room settled into its hush. Sometimes they faltered, flared in bursts at the mention of a beloved name, and then fell dumb when asked to perform under a newly imagined condition. Believers marked the surviving knocks as triumphs, skeptics marked the silences with asterisks. Lighting became another battlefield. Mediums asked for dimness to protect the delicacy of the manifestations, investigators asked for brightness to protect the public. Compromises produced that half-dark so beloved of theaters and conspiracies, bright enough to see hands, dark enough to flatter suggestion. Ushers enforced rules, no one under the stage, no sudden clapping, no touching the performers. Audiences, now half congregants and half inspectors, learned to participate in both modes at once, leaning forward to urge the miracle, leaning back to catch the trick. Some evenings collapsed entirely. A celebrated medium faltered when a woman of formidable calm placed both the medium's feet on her own shoes and pinned them there with the weight of her body. The raps dwindled to polite taps and died. In another city, a demonstration on a carpeted platform produced so little sound that the manager begged to move to a wooden one. When refused, he closed the meeting early, for want of conditions. Newspapers pounced on such failures, printing diagrams of imagined mechanics, spring-loaded toes, concealed sticks, assistants with hammers under the stage, a literature of exposure whose confidence far exceeded its proximity to actual practice. Yet other evenings refused to resolve. A physician held a medium's hands, a minister held her ankles, still the raps responded to questions whispered by a widow 3 rows back. Afterward, the minister wrote a testimonial that he had witnessed something beyond the power of human means. A magician wrote a rejoinder that he had seen the same trick in every fairground from Albany to Cincinnati. The public learned to live with dueling affidavits, each authoritative in its own register. In the noise between them lay the movement's true advantage. Consolation does not require unanimity. The Fox sisters stood at the hot center of these experiments. Leah, with a manager's nerve, insisted on terms that protected her charge and their livelihood, a platform they knew, arrangements they trusted, a committee with at least a few friendly faces. When a city's worthies insisted on choosing all the examiners themselves, Leah protested. Why should the girls submit to a tribunal assembled by people who wished them exposed? The protest nourished suspicion and loyalty at once, as such protests do. To believers, it proved prudence, to doubters, it proved fear. Money sharpened every test. An evening's failure cost rent and reputation, a success sold next week's tickets. Private sittings, better paid, easier to control, subsidized public demonstrations, where the sisters earned the moral capital of appearing before hostile eyes. We have nothing to hide, Leah would say as she denied a request to search the platform. The line between reasonable conditions and stage management blurred until neither side could pretend there was no stage at all. Into this fragile ecology entered the conjurer, part educator, part vandal, who offered lectures exposing the methods of mediums. He would begin by praising inquiry, lamenting the spread of credulity, invoking the sanctity of grief, then he would wrap the hall alive with knocks from his empty hands, produce spirit messages on slates he had rinsed in the audience's view, and, with a flourish, show where the trick had been hid. Such lectures played to packed houses. They had the flavor of a sermon and the fizz of a magic show, and they let the public indulge in both credulity and superiority in a single evening. Mediums despised them, newspapers adored them. Tests adapted. Investigators arranged chairs so that each leg stood in a shallow dish of sand or water, hoping to drown out vibrations. They placed the alphabet in random orders, so a medium could not memorize a rhythm. They asked questioners to write queries in advance and hand them to a neutral party, or to whisper so softly that no lip reader could steal a cue. Meanwhile, mediums adapted too. They sat with their heels forward, so any joint crack would travel away from the plank. They answered with softer knocks when conditions blunted the sound, claiming the presence was weak tonight. They deferred to the dead, who, being convenient, could be blamed for nearly anything, light too bright, company too hostile, air too cold. If you bring the right feeling, Leah would chide gently, the spirits will come closer. The most damaging challenges did not always come from clever apparatus but from ordinary control of vantage. In one city, a committee of respectable women insisted on placing the sisters' feet on their laps and their hands in plain view. The raps ceased entirely for 10 minutes, then resumed when the girls shifted slightly. The committee split in its verdict. The believers in the room cheered the resumption, the doubters wrote down the 10 minutes. Both stories appeared in the next day's paper, proof in the morning and proof of fraud by afternoon, depending on what you needed. To the sisters, the scrutiny felt less like science than like siege. Maggie's letters grew tense, needling between piety and exhaustion. Kate, younger and more brittle, took the pressure into her habits, dosing herself against the nerves of rooms that alternated between worship and ambush. Leah, who believed that management could carry them over any obstacle, booked more engagements, not fewer. Work is the antidote, she would say. Work also paid the rent. Outside the circles of test and counter-test, the culture of performance hardened into codes that protected the illusion. Lights low, chairs close, a respectful hush, a ban on unexpected touches, watchers chosen for character as much as competence. New mediums copied the posture as faithfully as the knocks. It was not that every performer calculated deceit, many believed in their own gift. But a technique repeated becomes a tradition, and a tradition acquires defenses that look, from the outside, like fortifications. Every exposure, real or theatrical, opened a small crack in belief, yet belief proved resilient. The human desire for a sign is not finally answerable by a diagram. A father who heard his dead child's name spelled back to him in a room full of strangers could hold that moment unaffected by a pamphlet about toe joints. A widow who felt her question answered at the exact letter she dreaded would not surrender the feeling to a treatise on acoustics. The movement survived by lodging itself where argument has less jurisdiction, in the private ledger of loss and its brief reprieves. Still, the tests left marks. Certain cities became harder rooms. Certain editors, once indulgent, now demanded certainty before they would run notices without ridicule. Will the ladies perform upon a stone floor? One advertisement demanded, snide in its cheerfulness. Will they consent to examination by a committee not of their choosing? Every demand set a stage that looked less like a chapel and more like a courtroom. The sisters, who had learned to turn a bedroom into an altar, now had to survive a bench. By the late 1850s and into the 1870s, the laboratory of doubt had done its work. It had not destroyed the movement, but it had framed it. Spiritualist evenings were now sold, in part, as tests the audience was invited to administer. Handbills boasted of prior examinations, managers promised every fair condition. The vocabulary of skepticism, controls, conditions, impartial witnesses, was absorbed into the show as a set of features. The sisters lived inside this double bind. To be believed, they had to invite the mechanisms that could undo them. To be safe, they had to arrange the very protections that looked like evasion. Behind the curtain, the private costs rose. Nights of strain spilled into days of quarrel, love affairs buckled under the odd pressure of being loved because one was believed, bottles and debts accrued. Leah pressed the schedule forward, more cities, more circles, because stopping meant admitting, if only to themselves, that the foundation had shifted. The girls, no longer girls, continued to sit, to smile, to listen for the cue. Behind the curtains, private struggles, love, money, family tension, would set the stage for confession. By the time the Fox sisters could fill a hall on name alone, their lives had been repackaged as a public utility. Patrons came with envelopes and expectations, editors with sympathetic prefaces, reformers with invitations stamped, for the good of the afflicted. Among the most visible allies was Horace Greeley, whose home and paper lent the girls both shelter and prestige. Patronage sounds benign in the abstract, in practice it is a kind of tether. The help that raised them up also held them in place. If the sisters' gift comforted the bereaved, it also became the thing friends urged them to continue for the sake of others, an ethic that could be equal parts compassion and coercion. Patronage braided into publicity. A parlor evening at a famous household promised gentle company in stable conditions. It also guaranteed that the next morning's column would pronounce the manifestations serious, moving, worthy of sober inquiry. Gratitude was expected, not just privately but performatively. The sisters were to be grateful mediums, grateful women, grateful dependents, grateful even for the chance to be believed. Gratitude and livelihood merged until, thank you, felt like an invoice paid in deference. When a supporter suggested a rest, it came wrapped in a new schedule. When a patron insisted on better pay, it arrived bundled with stricter rules, brighter lights, a longer list of dignitaries to impress. Maggie, the more inward of the two performers, learned the costs of being visible in love as well as work. She fell, against calculation and perhaps against self-preservation, for a celebrated Arctic explorer, a man of facts and fame whose letters alternated tenderness with campaigns to rescue her from the trade that had made her a name. He loved her and hated the rooms she worked in. He promised a different life if she would renounce the séances and step off the circuit. The offer cut to the marrow of her dilemma. To be believed as a woman in public, she had to continue the demonstrations. To be believed as a woman in private, she was asked to stop. Their courtship became a wrestling match with an audience of 1,000 paper readers. He argued that a respectable marriage required her to abandon a livelihood he considered humiliation in disguise. She argued that leaving the stage meant leaving her sister, her mother, and the only means they had to turn notoriety into rent. He came from a world where courage was proven by maps and ice, she from one where courage was sitting still while strangers judged your hands, your breath, your soul. When illness and distance took him, she was left not just with grief but with the echo of an unlived alternative life. She tried at various times to step away from the profession, to make declarations of renunciation, to seek different churches for different consolations, to accept simpler rooms with fewer eyes. Each retreat was brief. Need has a gravity of its own. Kate, gifted with a quicker spark on stage, paid in another currency. The pace that made a career, train, boarding house, parlor, platform, repeat, also made a nervous system that demanded dulling. Evenings spent satisfying the bereaved meant mornings spent under the weight of other people's sorrow, and nights alone meant the clamor of memory without the buffer of performance. Her marriage brought periods of steadier air, new cities, new circles, a measure of domestic shelter, but its protections were not lasting. Widowhood pressed her back into the market with a rawer edge, and the bottle, which at first took the sting from hostel rooms, soon demanded its own audience. Dependence blurs lines. Family tried to intervene, friends tried to help, newspapers tried to diagnose. Eventually courts were asked to consider what was best for those who depended on her, the children whose mother was famous for conjuring replies from the dead and infamous for needing quieting spirits of her own. Nothing in a medium's training equips her for the public arithmetic of custody and competence. Those hearings, whispered and printed, stripped privacy to the bone. The same public that had once asked her to produce comfort on cue now debated whether she should be trusted with bedtime. At the center of the orbit stood Leah, the eldest sister, whose managerial gifts gave the phenomenon a spine, and gave the family an axis they could not escape. She booked the rooms, negotiated the fees, fielded the abuse, and stood guard at the threshold where curiosity turned unruly. She also kept the accounts, arranged the travel, and decided when the girls would do one more sitting, add one more city, accept one more benefactor with a tender story and a firm hand. If the job was to keep the enterprise upright, then the enterprise required a manager's stubbornness. If the job was also to keep two young women intact, then management sometimes looked like pressure wearing a sister's face. Protection and exploitation are not opposites in families that survive by performance, they are stripes on the same rope. Leah protected the sisters from the worst of the gawkers and the rougher circuits, she also sold their evenings as healing and stoked precisely the demand that gnawed at their sleep. She scolded Kate's excesses and smoothed Maggie's tempers, she also convinced them to work through illnesses, quarrels, and shame. When money ran short, schedules lengthened. When reputation slipped, she booked rooms where friendly committees could be counted on. If anyone in the family believed most stubbornly in the mission, it was Leah, if anyone benefited most steadily, it was also Leah. The public became, over the years, a claimant on the sisters' bodies. Newspapers ran their faces, one solemn, one luminous, beside copy that treated them like public property, our mediums, the Fox girls, the Hydesville sisters. Invitations assumed availability, rejections were interpreted as arrogance or fear. Strangers addressed them with the intimacy of those who had sat in the dark and heard something impossible, strangers scolded them with the rancor of those who suspected they had been fooled. The sisters belonged, in a way that no man of their era was asked to belong, to the appetite of a nation, the appetite to be soothed, to be astonished, to be reassured that death was not a door but a curtain. Meanwhile, money, blunt, unromantic money, ran its tally. Hotels had to be paid in cash. Managers took their percentages. Dresses fit for stages wore out faster than dresses fit for kitchens. Trains charged regardless of whether the spirits performed on cue. Private griefs, an illness here, a death there, did not suspend rent. The economy of belief was steady only at the crowd scale, at the household scale it was precarious. A handful of slow months, a quarrel with a patron, a headline too sharp, and the sisters were writing letters they would rather not write, humbling themselves to benefactors they would rather not please. The more their identities fused to their work, the thinner the membrane between professional and personal became. Maggie could not simply be a woman who loved and doubted, she was the medium who loved and doubted, and whose doubts drew blood because they tugged at the thread of 1,000 people's comfort. Kate could not simply be a woman who drank too much, she was a public warning about the wages of pretending to talk to the dead. Leah could not simply be a determined eldest sister, she was a manager and therefore suspect in all the ways managers are suspect, especially when the workers are family and the product is solace. In quieter moments, the sisters tried to imagine exits. A school in a small town, perhaps, where they might teach piano and French and never be asked to produce a knock. A marriage on sensible terms. A modest annuity from grateful patrons. But exits are easiest before the first step on stage. After a decade of being the hinge between worlds, the world will not allow you to swing shut. People appeared at the boarding house desk begging for 10 minutes alone. Committees asked for one more controlled evening to silence the sneers. Editors wrote that a final, decisive demonstration would tidy up the quarrel once and for all. The sisters were asked to settle a national argument by continuing to be the argument. The result was a long corrosion, of health, of temper, of trust. Kate's drinking and Maggie's oscillations between renunciation and return were not mysteries to those who knew the schedule. One more night, Leah would say, and then a winter would pass. One more city, and then a year. The sisters did not lack conviction, they lacked air. The same country that proclaimed them wonders had also trained them to sit perfectly still while it decided who they were. There are only a few ways a life like that changes its course. A patron might turn rescuer and mean it. A scandal might close doors no manager could reopen. Or one of the principals might stand before the nation and invert the room, turn the stage lights toward themselves and call the performance by another name. For years that last possibility lived as rumor, that Maggie, the more solemn, might one day speak not for the spirits but for herself, that Kate, the more brittle, might nod and let the whole edifice crack. The pressures that once forged a career were now wrecking it by inches, lovers tired of sharing their beloved with the crowd, patrons pinched by embarrassment and fashion, debts that did not excuse themselves in the name of consolation. The label, the Fox sisters, had ceased to be a family name and hardened into a brand stamped on people who had outgrown it. A brand can be worn. It can also be set down in a gesture that looks like treason to those who bought the merchandise. And so the path that had begun with knocks in a small bedroom bent toward a different stage in a larger city, a stage not prepared for wonder but for judgment, not for tender questions but for the brutal arithmetic of proof and confession. Whether out of exhaustion, conscience, revenge, or the impossible wish for an ordinary life, one sister would decide to speak plainly. In 1888, the stage would no longer be for performance, but for demolition of the myth. The stage had always been arranged to make belief easy, a small table, a pair of chairs, the hush of a room willing to meet the dead halfway. On October 21, 1888, at the New York Academy of Music, the stage was arranged to do the opposite. Gaslight burned harder than usual, the hall brimmed with newspapermen, ministers, physicians, society women in dark silk, an audience of America looking itself in the mirror. When Margaretta Maggie Fox walked out in morning black, the room rustled with a decade's worth of rumor. She carried papers in her hand and a decision in her face. Her opening made the room flinch because it was simple. She said she had come to unveil the fraud. She spoke of Hydesville, of a bedroom where two children learned that rooms are instruments if you ask them to be. She described, without embroidery, how attention becomes employment, how employment becomes necessity, how necessity becomes a kind of trap. She did not sneer at belief. She did not jeer at grief. She told the story as if she were standing at the threshold of a house she had once lived in, trying to explain to strangers why the door would not stay shut. Then she demonstrated. She loosened the laces of her boots, slipped them off, and stood where the stage manager had laid a narrow wooden platform, a little island designed to carry sound. She lifted the hem of her dress to show her ankles, placed her feet lightly on the board, and let the hall grow quiet. The raps came in the familiar pattern, dry, percussive, oddly interior, as if they rose from inside the wood. A physician on the committee knelt, then another, each listening with the ceremonial gravity of men overhearing a confession. Maggie described the toe joint method, a trained ability to crack the joints of the feet, the vibrations traveling into wood like a telegraph key tapped under a table. She took questions and answered with counts of raps, just as she had on every other stage, only now the trick was named as trick. A wave passed through the audience, first a stiff, embarrassed cough of laughter, then the low collective sound people make when they are unlearning something they paid to believe. Some applauded, as if to congratulate themselves on their own skepticism at last confirmed. Some sat with their hands cramped, as if to keep from clapping at a funeral. In the front rows, a few women wept, not because the dead fell silent, but because of what they felt they had asked of a girl. Maggie read from a written confession, her voice moving between contrition and accusation. She had been a child, she had been encouraged, she had been managed. She said Leah had known, had understood at least enough to build a life on it, and had urged them forward when hesitation would have meant hunger. She spoke of Kate, whose talent for the room had curdled under the strain of being its instrument, whose drinking was both shield and saboteur. She spoke of love lost to the disgust other men felt for the trade that supported her, of the loneliness of being needed by 1,000 strangers and not quite wanted by herself. The papers made of it what papers always make, a verdict. Headlines declared a death blow to spiritualism. Columns savored the details of the demonstration, the unlaced boots, the board, the doctors bending like acolytes over a reliquary, then widened to argue that a national craze had been a national self-deception, that parlor solace had been a marketplace of tricks. Cartoonists gave Maggie the cruel gift of caricature, a woman knocking with her feet while fools leaned in. Pamphlets were revived and reissued, debunkers who had labored for years without the theater's spotlight now claimed vindication, waving her confession like a signed affidavit from the invisible. Believers rallied with equal energy. Spiritualist periodicals insisted that no single exposure could cancel thousands of sittings, that Maggie, bereaved and embittered, had been bribed or bullied into betraying her former self, that genuine manifestations were real even if some performances were counterfeit, that grief had been comforted, and comfort is its own proof. They printed testimonials from dignified men who had held the sisters' hands for hours and still heard the replies under conditions no toe could manage. They pointed out that some of the most powerful séances in the movement's history had involved no Fox at all. The middle ground, where most people live, filled with a quieter calculation. Many had never attended a séance, for them the confession confirmed a suspicion pleasantly warmed by scandal. Others had been comforted in a dark room once and did not intend to hand that moment back. If the trick explained the physics of a sound, it did not explain why a certain answer had arrived at the exact inch of a life where it could still do good. A nation did what nations do with complicated truths, it split them into stories it could live with. Maggie's gesture was not just theatrical, it was economic. The stage manager paid, a major paper paid, friends and enemies alike pressed money into her palms with the tidy logic of a transaction that solved both conscience and curiosity. But confession is not a profession. The fee runs out. The invitations thin once a story has been told to everyone who wants to hear it. Public penance does not translate to private income. Within months, the woman who had made a hall shake, first with unseen knocks, then with the sound of a life inverted, found herself back in the arithmetic she had tried to escape: bills, rooms, sick nerves, the heavy breakage of family. Her language, too, began to shift under pressure. She had wanted, perhaps, to end something, if not the movement, then her participation in it. What she ended instead was a season. In 1889, with money scarce, with friends of the movement promising help if she would soften the damage. With critics bored now that the firework had burst, Maggie issued a partial recantation. She said she had been harsh. She said she had spoken in anger, in sorrow. She said the dead were not so easily dismissed. The result did not restore what had been taken, nor did it completely undo the blow she had struck. It satisfied no one entirely. To believers, the correction seemed too late and too tactical. To skeptics, it was proof that she had never been trustworthy, even in contrition. Meanwhile, Kate, already under the weight of personal troubles, was dragged through the same public machinery. Courts tested her capacity as a mother, newspapers tutade, friends tried to rescue what could be rescued. The movement that had once sheltered the sisters as its founding sign shielded itself now by sacrificing them to the category of unfortunate women. It is one of the cruelties of reforming circles that they are swift to declare a beloved emblem inconvenient when the emblem becomes human at the wrong time. The spiritualist camp did something more complicated than simply deny. It absorbed. Leaders reframed the confession as a parable about the dangers of turning a gift into a trade, about allowing impresarios to stand between the spirit and the sitter, about the corruption that attends celebrity. In that telling, Maggie's exposure proved not that the dead do not speak, but that human beings, women desperate for safety, managers desperate for control, audiences desperate for spectacle, can drown out the faint voice that matters. Even skeptics recognize the deftness of this move. A belief with porous edges survives by letting damage pass through. The press, having devoured the confession, turned to the aftermath with a thinner appetite. Stories about the sisters' poverty were printed in a tone of pity edged with satisfaction, the moral reckoning of a marketplace. Relief funds were proposed, then lost to committee. Benefactors who had once booked them for consoling evenings now preferred to support institutions with cleaner stories attached. The sisters, each in her separate room, faced a harsher intimacy than any séance circle, the knowledge that public renown is an unreliable landlord. Yet even as Maggie stood on that 1888 stage and cracked the joints of her toes so that a nation could hear itself being fooled, the Hydesville house still stood, holding its own rumor. The story had always kept a reserve, some last card the movement or its enemies could play. Years later, a wall would give way, bones would be produced, headlines would shout, experts would frown, the faithful would nod, the doubters would smirk. The confession, dramatic as it was, did not own the ending. It triggered a season in which endings grew barbed and multiple. What the night at the Academy truly did was to strip the sisters' tale of the one comfort that fame had offered, clarity. Before, the girls had been either saints or charlatans, depending on the subscription you held. After, they were women who had been both obedient and cunning, both trapped and pragmatically free. The public prefers cleaner categories. The sisters, who had taught the country to listen for a yes or a no, left it with a human answer: it's complicated. In the logic of their story, the confession was a climax rather than a conclusion. The crowd got its spectacle of truth-telling, complete with props and doctors and ink-black headlines. But spectacle is a poor solvent for history. What it cannot dissolve, it vitrifies, fixes into glass the shapes people will point at later. The movement went on in rooms the sisters never entered. The sisters went on in rooms the movement never sanctified. And the house in Hydesville, quiet or not, listened to the footfall of a century that still wanted something from it. And then fate added irony, the old Hydesville house produced new evidence. The house that started it all had become a relic by the turn of the century, sold, resold, rented, whispered about. Children dared each other to touch its door. Old neighbors still told the story of that first March, when knock seemed to run like water through wood. In 1904, time itself did the knocking. Part of a cellar wall gave way, old brick loosened by frost and neglect, and behind it lay a clutch of bones. A local paper rushed the tale. The Boston Journal trumpeted the find as if a ghost had finally kept its appointment, the peddler's skeleton, discovered at last. The scene was the kind of theater the century had learned to love, a dim cellar, dirt sloughed into small hills, men with lanterns bending over a tangle of fragments. The inventory, as reported, wavered between the precise and the sensational, bits of a skull, long bones, scraps that might belong to a hand, announced with the confidence of headline type. Curious citizens filed down the steps to look, then filed back up convinced they had seen proof that a rumor had once been a man. It was the perfect sequel because it confirmed the first act without requiring anyone to have been wrong, a body, a crime, a voice in the floor. But examinations, such as they were, dulled the triumph. Doctors and skeptics handling the fragments found a jumble, a mix of human pieces and animal bones, chicken among them, arranged in a way that looked less like a grave and more like a plant. No missing person case could be attached. No coroner opened a proceeding. The law, having slept through the age of raps, did not wake for a box of unreliable bones. The discovery returned to the town the way it had come, by story. Believers said the earth had finally given up its secret, doubters said someone had supplied it. By then, the Fox sisters were gone. Leah had died in 1890, the organizer whose spine had held the enterprise together outliving her role as impresario by only a handful of quiet years. Kate followed in 1892, clever, brittle, exhausted by rheums and remedies. Maggie died in 1893, the woman who had once made a nation flinch by calling a miracle a trick. Their end was not dramatic, it was ordinary, which is its own kind of sorrow after a life spent being asked for wonders. They left behind letters, clippings, debts, a few keepsakes, and the kind of fame that curdles into footnote and fable. The movement they helped ignite did not die with them. It rarely works that way. Spiritualist congregations kept their Sunday schedules, parlor circles refined their props, abroad, mediums promised more than taps, full forms, scented flowers, trumpet voices. What had begun as a religion of sound acquired branches and bylaws. And even where it ceased to be belief, it remained custom, families gathered after supper, hands lightly touching on a tabletop, asking questions out loud into a room they had trained to answer. Later technologies, talking boards, spirit photography with better plates and worse scruples, translated the old grammar into new dialects. The dead, or the wish for them, kept pace with invention. The Fox story became a cautionary tale that refused to caution in only one direction. For skeptics, it was the classic anatomy of deception, a prank metastasized into a profession, amplified by credulous papers and a theater of grief, tricks teachable to any body with nimble joints and a stage with friendly acoustics. For believers, it was a parable about mismanagement and misuse, a genuine current, subtle and easily muddied, forced into paying circuits, its young conduits overworked until they broke, its first sign drowned by the noise of money and demand. For historians, it stood as a mirror for the century's appetite, the longing to democratize wonder, to test mystery with committees, to buy consolation by the ticket. Hydesville itself became an iconography of ambiguity. Visitors wanted to stand where it started, to peer into the cellar where the wall had fallen, to rehearse the sequence as if reenacting could redecide it, bedroom, knocks, neighbors, rumor, digging, nothing, then, decades later, something. The sight drew both pilgrims and scoffers, which is to say it continued the work the sisters had done in life, convening a mixed congregation under one leaky roof. When the place finally burned, as old houses sometimes do, its ashes only hardened the outline of a story that no longer needed wood to support it. What, in the end, did the raps prove? That depends on what the hearer required. They proved, to some, that a human body can be trained to counterfeit meaning. They proved, to others, that meaning will arrive where it is asked for long enough by enough people with enough ache. They proved, perhaps most honestly, that a nation frantic with loss, in cholera years, in war years, in ordinary years when children die in clusters and letters go missing in snow, will build a device to speak back. The device may be a telegraph or a photograph or the metronomic pops of a girl's well-trained foot. The point is connection. The Fox sisters' gift, whether you treat it as invention or intervention, was to give the century a ritual for that desire. There is a moral available here, clean and tempting, do not be fooled. There is also a harder moral, notice why you want it to be. The sisters' lives twist the two together. They were agents, clever, industrious, complicit, and they were instruments, managed, consumed, forgiven when useful and discarded when not. The public that loved them asked too much because it needed too much. The girls delayed the bill until they were women, and then they paid it. Imagine, for a last picture, a wooden chair in a plain room. The light is low because evening has decided it will be. Someone asks a question the way people do when they expect no answer and hope for one anyway. Against the hush, a tiny sound, a dry rap, travels through wood with more authority than any sermon can muster. Whether it comes from a joint or a ghost is, finally, the secondary question. The primary one is need. Spiritualism may have sprung from trickery, but it revealed something prior to trickery, the human hunger to speak with the dead and to be answered, even once, even ambiguously. The Fox sisters' tale is a ledger of costs, family, bent by ambition, women, bent by a public's appetite, truth, bent by grief until it gives. Their legacy is doubled on purpose, a warning about how easily performance can imitate revelation, and a mirror held up to the face of a century that asked for comfort out loud. The last question was never, where did the raps come from? It is, why did we need them so badly, and what do we ask to knock for us now?